Masterminds have been around for a long time, right? But unless you had a bunch of extra income to throw at it, you couldn't be a part of it. Well, we wanted to solve that problem. And so we're bringing masterminds to you for free. Welcome to Mastermind for the Masses.
Hey everyone, welcome to Mastermind for the Masses. I've got Colby and Shan here, like always. And, how's it going this week, guys? What do you got going on? Shan, what's up?
It's been a pretty good week. It's been really slow this week, I think mostly because of probably the drastic weather changes that we've been dealing with. It's caused me to make sure I handle things outside at the same time, try to get outside as well. But other than that, it's been pretty good. I accidentally shaved my beard off, so there's that. But I'm growing it back. So other than that, it's been good.
Nice. Yeah, I did not accidentally shave off my beard. I have to do that every day because I don't have one. So
I'm in the same boat, Colby. I can't grow right here. That's why I shave about once a week, but I do that mainly because the beard looks worse than not having a beard. So
yeah, than just not having it. Yeah, exactly.
It's not a good look for someone with a beard company, that's for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. On my end, been pretty slow week here at work, so I've actually just been doing a bunch of training in regards to coding and stuff like that. So I'm still finishing up a Python coding course online. I'll actually shout it out. It's called boot.dev. Pretty nice. It's like a gamified way of learning how to code, and it takes you through a bunch of different stuff. Python's not the only one, but it's like the introductory one, and then it goes through like stuff like object-oriented programming, Go, and a few other things. But it's like a pretty long thing. It's kind of like a way of learning how to code and actually getting into a developer job if you really wanted to. But it just depends on how interested you are in learning it, obviously, because it's pretty much like you just do as much as you want to. There's no like thing that says, hey, you need to get X and Y done. So it's kind of nice. So it's like a subscription model. So it's pretty cool.
Very cool. Self-paced learning can be great as long as you have the discipline and determination to go through it, for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of discipline and determination, I've been continuing to pursue, my extracurricular activities around kind of the new book, and along with that came a personality assessment. So I actually launched kind of the first version of that to friends and family. So kind of just building a data set around that and seeing if any tweaks or revisions need to be made, even around the experience of taking the assessment. But that's designed to really allow you to maximize the results that come out of the material in the book. So pretty excited to see all that coming together, and hopefully, I'm still targeting to have the book out this in Q2 here, and hopefully launch the assessment at the same time. So exciting stuff around all of that. But as I look at all this internal reflection, I've been thinking a lot about kind of external perspective, and what I wanted to talk to you guys about today, I brought this topic, is kind of how we view the world, right? And how we look at other folks, and possibly maybe either through what is that lens, right? When we're looking at other people and their life choices or what they're doing professionally or personally, right? Are we looking at that through a lens of curiosity? Is it looking at it through a lens of judgment, envy? And what drives that perspective? Because I think the way we look at the world externally probably influences our actions internally. And I just kind of wanted to get your guys' thoughts around that, because it's something I've always been very introspective and trying to look at myself. And this is still doing that, but it's looking at how I look at people externally. And so I was just curious what your guys' thoughts are around that. If you have, thoughts or strategies around how to ensure that, the way you're viewing the world is the way you want to view the world, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it does in a way.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really interesting. I think it's like a very important thing to be. I think like I always talk about like awareness and like self-reflection, or what's mindfulness is like the kind of term I think gets thrown a lot with stuff like this. But but it's definitely really important because it's going to exist whether or not you realize it or recognize it. You know what I mean? Like how you view people and like with the lens that you use is it's already selected. So whether or not you know which lens you're using, it's kind of irrelevant in the sense that it's going to happen regardless of your awareness. So you might as well like try to begin that process of self-understanding from that point of view. But obviously it's really hard to do that because I think it requires you to have a level of honesty with yourself that few people have the mental strength and courage, I think, to do, because I think you learn some really unpleasant things about yourself, at least in my experience. Like, like learning that like, oh, I'm actually just very envious of these types of this quality or anything like that, right? So like when I see things related to that, I'm imbued with a sense of envy, and it taints how I can view this, right? Rather than like, being happy for that person and being and sharing their joy and their accomplishments, that sort of stuff, right? So I think that part of it, I think, is just really difficult to do. But I do think once you can at least figure it out, you can at least try to take steps to correcting it if you see fit. That's at least like kind of like my initial thoughts.
I think that makes sense. Shan, kind of as a follow-up question to that, a couple weeks back, we got to have an amazing conversation with John Nocter on psychological safety. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that one, definitely go check that out. Let us know in the comments what you thought about it. But the reason I bring that up is because I was thinking about John, and he shared with us that he is heavy into photography and that he had just gotten a new lens. And one of the things Colby said is kind of that lens you already kind of have it, but obviously when you're taking photos and things like that, you have to focus the lens and you have to adjust it. And maybe sometimes you have to even switch out the lens for the appropriate shot. Shan, I know you do some photography a little bit too, and have some lenses and things like that. So I thought that analogy might stick a little bit, but
yeah.
Do you think that plays a factor in like when you're trying to adjust your worldview? Are you able to kind of do focus, or do you literally have to swap out the lens sometimes and just come from a different point of view?
So I'm going to try to continue your analogy the best I can. But I think what's important for that is to have emotional confidence and to be able to reflect, because you will never know what lens to use until you look back at the picture you've taken and reflect and kind of analyze like, okay, the background was washed out, or the focus was too tight, or just the distance was off. You really won't have any of that perception until you take the time and reflect. And I think, like according to your question, I think it takes a lot of emotional maturity, because like Colby said, and I agree with, everyone's got a specific lens that they see the world through. And right away, whether they like it or not, they generate opinions based off of that. But if you're emotionally mature enough, you can kind of step back and rethink that, right? Because a lot of people, they'll hear things or view things in a very specific way, and they'll almost be afraid to reflect, especially when it comes to like, I don't know, like politics or like religion or anything like that. They almost want to avoid that step on just pausing and thinking about, okay, like what are the other point of views? Like what are the other ways of looking into this? Because at that point, it kind of challenges what you think and believe, and kind of directs you to use maybe a different lens the next time you think about a specific scenario, or the next time that you're like approached with, I don't know, a specific view. So I think that's important, right? Like I think no one's going to know when to swap out their lens or make adjustments until they can really learn to analyze the post result. So the way that analogy would work is someone has a specific view on something. They understand that they have a specific view because of their lens, but the extra step they can take is kind of like think back, why do I think that way? Or why do other people think this way? And how can I kind of adjust my view to maybe, get that perfect picture? So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
No, it does. It actually got me thinking of, and I know I keep going into this photography analogy thing, but it got me thinking a little bit into, I'm sure you guys have seen like the new features that Google Pixels have been highlighting, right? And they've got that magic eraser where you can take that photo bomber out of your picture or do something,
Yeah.
but that's after you've taken the picture, right? It doesn't erase them in the moment or before. So it kind of talks to that reflection that you're talking about. So, you know, obviously we can't do that in real life. We can't go backwards and take out whatever perspective we had if we didn't like it, or add things in like we would with Photoshop. But taking that time to reflect hopefully does allow you to maybe make those small adjustments so that next time that instinctual worldview lens, because obviously when you were born, right, that worldview lens got developed over time. So I would like to think personally that that lens is going to continue to be developed until, you know, the I finally call it, right, and the end of my
Yeah.
days. Um, so I think life becomes a series of kind of adjusting that lens, but I do think it gets a little bit more challenging as you get
Well,
older, as you start to
that
lock in.
that's another important piece too, and you constantly hear this from like any photographers out there will know that like you can take really any lens and master it and figure out how to take the perfect photo with the perfect aperture with the perfect focus on any lens, as long as you can, you know, take the time to actually adjust and learn how to use that lens. But I think your AI magic eraser is important too, because in that sense, yeah, sure, you're able to kind of like replicate the usability of the lens, or at least like modify it, right? But you're altering reality in that sense. Like it's not authentic. And the same goes for life, right? Like you can apply like a quick fix or like some kind of like AI enhancement to that certain specific environment, but it's just not authentic. And technically you're altering reality. So it's important, I think, to be emotionally confident enough to reflect and say like, okay, I made a mistake. Let me go back in and kind of relook how I view this.
I totally didn't think about taking it this way until what you said. And that's what I love about this pod, right? Is because we literally are just talking, right? And talking
Yeah.
through these ideas, and it takes us to places. And I'm curious, you know, and I think I want to get Colby's perspective on this, because I know he's not as big into social media. He shared that with us, but he is kind of in that generation piece. Like talking about what you just talked about, Shan, with altering reality. You know, a lot of times, especially in this day of social media and posting and all of that, we tend to see like the best, right, of everybody. Like they're creating the highlight reel of their life, and even if they're having a bad day, they can post a picture with a caption that maybe makes it not feel that way. So our external perspective or looking at that might be one of those envy ones. It might be one of those, you know, judgment ones, depending on what it is. How do you keep that in check in a world where people are purposely kind of putting out the best view, right? Because it'd be very envious to be like, oh man, look at everything they're doing, but then you don't see that their life is falling apart, right? Because they're not posting those pictures. Like, how do you keep it? How do you keep a real, authentic perspective in a world that doesn't necessarily present that? And I know that's a big question, but
Yeah, obviously I don't have like the catch-all answer for something like that, but I can at least give my thoughts on it. So I would say the first thing is distancing yourself from the mediums where perfection is always attempted to be displayed like to you, because like if that's all you're looking at, if that's all you consume every single day all day, then I don't care how mindful you are, that is going to warp your perception quite significantly. So I do think you need to have a limited dose of those things, just because like I can't imagine the mental strength that would be needed to not be influenced by it to any degree. So I would say like that's a pretty important step to take. But then two, I think it's equally important to have yourself actually grounded in day-to-day reality, whether that's at your job, in your life with your family, in the hobbies that you do, et cetera, because that's where you actually get to see real people acting in the world. And that's super important because like that's the thing that always that I always like call bullshit on is like when I see these like perfection posts or whatever, it's just like, man, you just do not know what's going on behind the scenes. And so like there's this inherent skepticism that I can like bring to my how I'm viewing or using what lens I'm using to view that. Because in the real world, I see people making mistakes. I see people who seem super sure of themselves and have no idea what they're doing, right? Like I see all the imperfections in people around me, which is great. Like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's like I always feel I feel much more comfortable once I finally get through like when you first meet someone, they do the same thing that they do on Instagram. They try to give you you're in an interview, they give you their best look, right? Or, you just meet someone down the hallway and you're walking and you say, hey, and maybe you talk chit chat for a bit. They're probably still going to give you a quick snapshot of who they are, but they're probably going to try to put on a good face, right? I've never personally been a big fan of those interactions for exactly that reason, because it almost feels to some degree super inauthentic. It can be authentic, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times it just feels very like you're just doing it to be nice or whatever like that. And there's some degree of niceties that you have to adhere to, and I understand all that, but yeah, you just don't get in someone's true authentic self. And yeah, I don't know. I've just never enjoyed that. But like when you finally get to know someone, and like at first you're like, man, this person's like really smart, or they got it all together. And it's like kind of intimidating. It's like you almost like don't want to interact with them to some degree because it's like you're scared to interact with them because you feel like they got it all sorted out. But then it just takes that one thing where they're like, it's almost like a slip up, or they're finally just being they're on the cells, and they kind of, lift the veil, so to speak. And you're like, oh, you're just a normal person. Like there's not like, that's my favorite moment with people, is just that I realize there isn't something inherently special about them. Like I know that kind of sounds bad, but like I don't personally think it is. Like there's nothing special about me in the sense that like there's something inherently different. Like I do certain things, I act certain ways, I hold certain beliefs, and like those things create the totality of me, right? There's not like a specific attribute that no one else can obtain with without any effort or without any attempt, right? So I think that to me is how you can stay just very grounded in life, and the fact that like, yeah, people don't have it all together. You just only see that sometimes, but like if you just extrapolate the times where you do get to see the imperfections, like if it exists there's no reason it can't and should not exist other places, right? That you just didn't get the time or availability to see. That's at least kind of like my thoughts around it.
I think it's a great point. Dale Carnegie, I think it was, that, in his How to Win Friends and Influence People book, right? He talks about how people like people that are like them. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm flawed. So I like being around other flawed people, because there's also a sense of, the inability to relax, or a lack of comfort when you're around somebody
Mm-hmm.
that has that perfect persona, because you feel like you have to almost live up and match that perfection. And so then you don't feel comfortable, which means that you're not really getting the chance to be that authentic and vulnerable self. So that relationship at least takes longer to build, probably, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
nobody's perfect, nobody's flawless. And to your point earlier, right? When you first meet someone, you're not going to walk up and list the laundry list of things that are going wrong in your life either, because that's weird, right? So there is a balance, and as that relationship develops, I think it's a mix, right? You have to. It's kind of chicken or egg. You have to be authentic and vulnerable for a relationship to grow, but you need the relationship to have grown to a certain point before that becomes natural. So it's definitely an interesting challenge to have. Thinking through that, um, how do you guys approach those initial connections with people, right? Because obviously we kind of started off, you have a snap judgment when you see somebody. Again, that's what a first impression is, right? But I think that emotional maturity Shan was talking about forces us to not always stick with that um, first impression, because it may be false. So I'm curious, you guys have an approach or strategies that we can share with the listeners here around how you kind of get over maybe that initial first impression, or conversely, like lock it in, right? Because it could be accurate as well. Like, how do you define whether that first impression is something to trust or something to kind of be like, oh, maybe I misjudged that person, or maybe it didn't come across appropriate?
It's a tough one.
Why don't you go
It's a
first?
tough one. Yeah, I mean, it's really going to be the same kind of analogy and the same approach is being able to reflect. And I think some people do struggle with that when it comes to like personal connections too, because not only do they see the world through one specific lens that isn't ever adjusted, but they might also feel that way about people, especially before they meet them. So fortunately, I think it's just a constraint that whenever you can kind of focus and work on that emotional maturity and that emotional confidence, I think it just kind of goes hand in hand, because I think about that a lot. A lot of people are like, oh, first impressions are so important. But when I like reflect back on that, it's like everyone I've met, I don't judge them off of a first impression. Like I judge that. In fact, like I kind of don't judge anyone until I really get to know them. Like I kind of just think of them as a stranger until they're not. It's weird. And I've always noticed like I felt different in that sense. Like more people are able to get like a good read, and I'm terrible at like giving someone a good read is like the con of that situation. I don't have a good people filter is what like a lot of people call it, but I don't know. I like at the same time I'm kind of proud of that, because you really don't know what you're or who you're analyzing like off of an hour of knowing them. So it's tough. Like I don't have a strategy for it. I try to again like handle that emotional maturity with reflection, because it matters a lot for me.
It's such an interesting choice of words, right, with the emotional maturity, because I think about it and I agree with you from an adult perspective, but then I think about relationships, and the purest relationships are, think about kids on a playground. They may have never met each other. They're not looking to get anything out of each other. They're never going to potentially see each other again, but they can connect, play, have a conversation, get along, have a great time. They're not like, over time, I think, especially as we grow into society, like we lose a little bit of that, right? So there's an aspect of these young kids that have this emotional maturity around the openness and willingness and to
So
create a relationship.
I would say don't look at maturity that way, right? Like it's not something that like just because there's maturity in the phrase emotional maturity doesn't mean it's something that like builds up over time. In fact, I think it's lost over time, right? And I think your kid analogy is perfect for that, because I think children kind of operate on an innocent basis where they haven't been served distrust, they haven't been served like any kind of like heavily negative, like what's the word I'm looking for? Like vengeance or
hurt,
right. Yeah. They really haven't they haven't struggled through any of that like emotional damage that would cause them to be kind of have their walls up and not reflect. So actually in a weird scenario, although I use the phrase emotional maturity, I do think it can weaken over time. The longer you kind of go through those situations and at the same time refuse to go back and reflect, because the kid's not, they're not worried about like who's going to maybe, turn on them and not be their friend the next week or anything. They're more alive in the moment. And they're allowing themselves to be authentic as much as possible without judging.
Yeah, I don't think that's not maturity though. That's just complete innocence and unawareness, which is like that's importantly two different things, right? Like I think it's Nietzsche, or I can't remember which philosopher it is, but the idea was that he laid out was that you cannot be moral if you don't have the ability to be evil, essentially. Like if you can't go against the morals because you're too afraid or you're too scared, you're not a moral person, you're just weak, in some sense, right? Like you're not actually choosing to be moral because there isn't a choice, right? So the lack of choice, I think, matters there. So like in this context, like I think kids are a great depiction of like what's possible and like what we can get to, but they're not mature. They're just unaware, right? So I think that's an important distinction. So I still think you're right, Shan, that you do not everyone develops it, is the thing too, is that like it is a developed skill over time, because like the problem is that you get hurt, you have negative experiences, and you put up walls. You put up walls around you to reach the desired social goal and avoid things that you want to avoid and have things that you want to have. So I think like that's the key thing, is knowing what walls you're putting up and why, and what like honestly your goal is with your social interactions, right? Like that's why I've always really disliked the idea that first impressions are the end all be all, because to me it almost feels like you're treating people as books on a shelf in a library, and that you can
Yeah.
just flip at the first page, scan it real quick, and then throw it aside like it's trash,
Yeah.
and or
Give it
like
a
you're not
rating too.
interested. Yeah, and it's just like, yes, I understand that like we have limited time, and that's kind of why people use first impressions as a way to decide whether or not they're going to invest into reading the full book, so to speak. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that like the first page isn't the book; it's the first page. And I think like the level of judgment after reading the first page should not be as high as it is. I think, as certain people, give it credit to. I do think there's a level of skill that can be and is helpful to develop with first impressions, but you don't get a full view of that person, because every first page is different too, right? Like sometimes you just get an absolute asshole in front of you, right? And they're super mean to you and they're just completely rude, and obviously your first impression is going to be negative, and rightfully so. You probably don't want to interact with that person, right? Like it's a high chance. So it's very like black and white almost in that situation. But you could also argue that there's a 5% chance maybe they were just having a really bad day, and you guys might actually really click with each other if you gave them a second chance. So it's like, I just think that that whole thing is super important, because it all boils down to what's your goal, right? What's your goal with your social interactions? And I don't think there's like a right answer, so to speak, but I just think people should be aware of that, because I'm like you, Shan, where like I'll put some level of like, import on someone's first interaction with me, but like it's just not the end of the world to me. Like I'd rather get to know them a little bit more before I make a really harsh judgment about who they are and what their character is.
Right.
Do you think those walls that you were talking about, because I think we all do it, right? We all put up walls. But do you think that that impedes any of the authenticity or the vulnerability that you were referencing earlier to in the strengthening and building of those relationships? Right? Because one of the things I experienced when I was younger, I put up many walls to kind of protect myself, like you do, right, on certain things. And what I realized is, yes, nothing could get in, but that was also all of the good stuff, right? Like it was, I mean, that's the purpose of a wall. It blocks not only the bad, but it blocks everything. And yes, you could argue maybe you have like a gate that you can open for certain things, but I think that's easier said than done when you actually construct that wall. Cause I don't think many people are thinking when they're putting up this wall to protect themselves, well, let me leave this access point. Right. And so I'm just curious how you think that influences your ability to be authentic in a relationship, if you've got these walls prepared.
Oh, I mean, 100%. Like, I think it impacts it significantly, especially depending on what the wall is. And I think, like, this is something I personally have struggled with quite a bit, because I'm very much like an introvert, or like a very shy person when you probably first meet me. Like, I don't share a lot about myself to people, especially like personal aspects and stuff like that. And so I'd have to get really close to you and trust you before that
So
happens.
why not hop on a podcast and share your thoughts with the world?
Yeah.
Yeah. The like there is like there and that's what's like kind of weird, is because like I actually recognize it about myself too, because like if I can put myself in a situation where I feel comfortable, then like I open up completely, right? Like I tend to not have many barriers once I can get over that initial like hesitation. And it probably also helps that I feel like I'm just talking to you guys. I don't actually see or notice the audience that may be listening, which helps a lot, I think, with that whole shyness. But yeah, no, I think it matters a lot, because I think like even in my personal relations with friends, family, loved ones, it's something that's difficult, just because I don't know, you worry about like what people are going to think about you after you tell them something vulnerable about yourself, like something negative that happened, or something that you feel was very bad that you did, even, right? Like we all will regret actions in our life that we did, that we would smack ourselves for if we were given the opportunity to. And yeah, it's just tough. And I think, it's not that I still think there's still things that you shouldn't share necessarily with other people. I think there's the right time, the right place, the right moment, and these sorts of things that need to be set. But I think that's probably the key, is that it's less of it's more like a firewall than it is a brick wall, in the sense that you can set filters on when you allow the information to pass for people who are like really IT savvy. It's essentially like setting conditions with which information can flow from one point to the other. And I think that's more akin to or that's more what you should be aiming for a healthy relationship, is that sort of setup, I would guess.
No, I really like that analogy. I've never thought about that. And you're right. You do have to be probably a little more IT inclined to get it. But
No, it works for cars too.
Yeah, that's true. Or
So,
buildings,
yeah.
right? Buildings firewalls also.
Yeah,
So
but
the fire won't
like,
spread.
you still get cables running through that are meant to run through, but it blocks out, like, just in case the engine blows up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Colby, the king of analogies. No.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, no, I was just, I appreciate all of you guys' thoughts around this, because it's just been something that's on my mind, right? It's even if we think about our listeners, right? They're sitting here, they're watching us, and they're either agreeing or disagreeing. And, if either way that you feel, we'd love to have you actually comment on here and share with us, let Colby know how he's doing with his introverted approach here. I think everyone's doing fantastic, but, we want to hear what you are feeling too. So please share that down there, because we are being vulnerable here and trying to kind of build these relationships with you all. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of out of ideas around what we were talking about with this. I think your perspectives were really good, but is there anything else that you guys wanted to touch on around this concept of first impressions, relationship building, and just kind of that lens that we view the world with?
I did like
one.
Oh, go ahead,
Jen.
the delay of being virtual. No, I was just going to throw in that when we talked about first impressions, we kind of highlighted like why it's important to kind of not believe in first impressions as someone on that side of the scope. But obviously it's human nature, and it's always going to be just something that, might be expected by default on the other end of the scope, right? So I thought it was interesting when we talked about like handling first impressions. I'd like to hear what you guys' quick strategies are for that. I always think, so when I hear like first impressions and someone who wants to work on their first impression, I always think about like an album release, or like actually your guys' scenario about a book, right? Like the front page was really good, right? Like if you nail that, the book could probably suck, and you won't know it until you really get to know the book, you know what I mean? But I always think of an album release, right? Like, why is it every time an artist that you listen to releases an album, those first 3 songs that get pre-released are just so good, and then the rest of the album is like, what did I buy? What did I pre-purchase? And it's not always that case, but more likely than not, the best 3 songs are going to be EP'd or like released early from that album. And then the rest of the album is going to be just like floaters that they tried to fill in the space. And I kind of think it's important, like when you're handling first impressions, the same way, right? Because unfortunately, not everyone's going to have our mindset we're talking about on like not judging for the first time they meet someone. But like if you think about it that way, it becomes a little bit more easier to strategize on how you should come off, or like what you should highlight about yourself whenever you're meeting someone that's important to you for the first time.
I do have an approach so that I don't get locked in necessarily, or I can confirm my first impression. So usually when you have that first impression, positive, negative, whatever the case may be, there's something that triggers that. Like you can kind of point to it. It's very rarely that you're like, I don't know why, but I just like this guy, right? There may be sometimes that happens, right? Or I don't know why, but I just don't like that person. And again, there might be times, but I would encourage people to try to drill into the why behind that, because then that's when I might ask like exploratory questions into that topic. So let's say somebody says something when I first meet them that's just rubs me an odd way. I might ask like a follow-up question to see, is this really like a divide for us, or did I misunderstand them? Or, Colby's point earlier, are they just having a bad day? Can I get kind of to the root of who that person is? Because there are going to be people that I don't want to invest my time around. that happens. And but I don't think you can judge that off of like a single impression or anything like that. So, but what I try to do is get to the root of it quicker, so I know if that time investment is worth it to actually build the relationship to a point where we can be vulnerable and authentic and feel good about that, or is this truly like, take it back to like, I'm happily married, so this isn't my case anymore. But like when you are dating, right, there is a red flag. A lot of people have like a list of red flags and they're like, oh, this will not work. Like, for instance, if you want to have kids and they don't, like a lot of folks, that's going to be kind of a deal breaker, right? Like, okay, well, this is just isn't going to be a compatible long-term relationship. And I think you can kind of do a similar approach when you meet someone is, okay, this is like a core fundamental belief of mine. They're adamantly opposed to that. Is this something we can get past? Or is this something that we just aren't going to be a good fit together? And I think asking those follow-up questions quickly and early on, to get those clarifying points does help you kind of understand that point of view.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Josh's stuff on that. And I would say from the perspective of not just getting information about the other person in the first impression, but in terms of what you're giving to the other person, for me, I think it all boils down to, again, like what's your goal when you're having these interactions. So I think in the sense that if you're trying to actually, if your goal is to make that person see the absolute best side of you, and you really want to make sure that you like, obviously like nail it on the head, like do a perfect job of doing that, like you can go that route. But like that's, I think, a very small percentage of most interactions that you have where you provide a first impression to someone. Like that would be like your job interviews, you're out on a date, you're meeting your significant other's parents, like those sorts of things, right? Like, where you're trying to like smile, be nice, tell them about yourself, ask questions about them, right? There's like tons of, I mean, if you just look up how to do an interview, it's probably a great way of how to learn how to do those types of impressions. But honestly, I think the more meaningful ones are actually the ones where there's less effort on your part in terms of how cognizant you are of your impression. And I think that's like your default mode almost. And I think that's the one that should get more attention paid to it. And at least for me, I just don't actually like putting a lot of effort into it. And it's kind of because for my sort of just day-to-day interactions or the people that I want to be friends with and click with, I don't want them to see a side of me that like I'm not really at all the time, because like I'm not going to be super upbeat, chippy all the time. I'm going to be pretty relaxed. I'm going to, shoot the shit a bit. I'm going to crack some jokes. I'm just going to have a good time. But like I'm not going to be this happy-go-lucky, like really chippy person. So I don't want to give them that impression of me, because that would set false expectations, which would just cause issues down the line. So I think for me, it's just all about trying to be as much of myself in a relaxed setting as possible for those interactions, just because like I think like at a default you're still being nice and you're still going to be courteous and all those sorts of things, right? But you're not going to lead someone on to believe that you're someone that's actually different from who you really are. It's kind of how I view it.
Authenticity is key. Colby, you were trying to bring up another point, I think, too, when you and Shan were both throwing something out there. Did you want to cover that?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. Like, it was going back to the whole lens thing of like you can select a lens based on what you need to do, essentially. And I was just kind of curious because I feel like, again, it's kind of the point I just made, where it's like a lot of times people just have a default thing that they're just rocking and rolling with, right? They're not thinking about this stuff all the time, right? They're not on a podcast thinking about this for an hour. They're not, they're not taking a bunch of time out of the day to really put a lot of thought into it on average. So it's like I guess it's kind of like, at what points have you guys, because I feel like for me it's more like major life things where I like change my lens. I don't actually change it on a day-to-day basis, or if I do change it on a day-to-day basis, it's because I'm going into situations that I've already pre-prepared in some sense or had experience with, where I know that I need to, be mindful of how I'm thinking and change the way I'm thinking to approach the situation in the best way possible that I've already reflected on, right? Or it's like a major life event where I'm forced to actually rectify what's going on, how am I looking at things, et cetera. Like really, really taking stock, right? So I was kind of curious, like what your guys' opinion is on that. Slash, like, what do you guys have like a similar take on it, or is it you guys think about that stuff more often?
I'll default to you, Shan. I have some thoughts, but I'd be curious what you have to say before I jump in.
Yeah, I thought about this when we were getting closer to that kind of that like quick synopsis roundup of everyone's thoughts. I thought about like what actually causes me to like promote myself with that emotional maturity to like step back and reflect and actually adjust my lens. And I think I've gotten into the habit of it at an early stage, kind of because I'm forced to, right? And I'll step into like the entrepreneur side for this, because if I were to take my perceptions and like what I believed in and ran with it and never adjusted, especially for like the branding of both of the businesses that I run, I would have been done year one, right? Like it would have never happened. And I wouldn't say that that was like the start of when I started to kind of like step back and reflect. I think there's a lot of layers to this. I used to have a blog when I was younger, and writing that blog, like I've always taken things with like a data and analytical approach to where like, okay, this didn't work. I need to like just put my ego aside and readjust. And I think for our audience, or at least like this time, day and time, like I think social media is a good example of that, right? Like I don't think many people just pop off, and when we're talking like influencers or celebrities, right? Like I don't think they just pop off like naturally. I think what their really good universal skill is like they're able to post, create, or throw something up that might not be well received or be boring or non-entertaining, and then kind of like take that moment to reflect, adjust, and make it better and better and better every time. Like I'm a firm believer in like the compound effect, and I think it works for everything. So in my mind, like, and especially when it comes to like any kind of new ideas or anything that's new to me and I'm looking through on my lens, it's already in the front of my mind, like as soon as I'm going through something new, to like kind of like reflect and treat it differently, or like readjust, because it's worked so well for me in the past, to kind of just throw away my ego and try to think in the perspective of like results, right? Like if you go on social media and you post, I don't know, for a year straight, and you promise that you'll kind of take a moment to reflect and make adjustments every time you post, I think it's inevitable you're going to be a top performer or a top influencer or whatever you're going for by the end of year one. Same thing with the brand. Like if you're tackling an audience and you're trying to figure out an audience for your brand, same thing, right? Like if you can put your ego aside and you can analyze those results and how people are like emotionally reacting to the stuff you're putting out there, it's really kind of like a cheat code, in all honesty.
Yeah.
But
I would say from my perspective, right, I think I spend more time trying to focus my lens than I do necessarily swapping to a different one. But I will say there are times when I swap lenses, and I think that is more driven off of what role I'm filling, right? Because
yeah,
my role as a husband, my role as a father, my role as like a director, or my role as, like podcast host, or, whatever my role is, the lens that I use may be different based on the responsibilities that I have in those arenas. But again, I think I spend more time once I have that lens on, more on the focusing of the lens and trying to make those small adjustments to really get the best picture possible.
I really love this analogy because it just makes so much sense, because I am such a crappy photographer, because I'm still new to it and I'm trying, right? But I have 6 lenses, and that is like something no new photographer ever does. They don't go out and buy like all these different lenses for different, but like I don't know. I just like to kind of choose the best lens for the best situation. And that's totally like my mindset. My mindset is never to like master the most universal one, and which I think that like the best photographers do. But it's funny that with that analogy, because as soon as you said like, oh, you focus more on focusing your lens. Like I'm the exact opposite.
Well, and I got to ask you, Shan, did you like make a deal with yourself that every week you didn't take photos, you were going to buy a new lens? Or
No, what it is,
the
man,
guitar
is
approach?
I mean, here's my mindset broken down, right? Like when I stepped into photography, I trusted the pros, right? And everyone has a different mindset. Everyone has a different view, but a lot of them have the same alignment. And the true masters will know what lens works in the best situation. And regardless of my emotional attachment to the one lens that I bought and I thought was the best, if there's 20 other like professionals making videos or like content and covering like how great this lens is in this specific environment, like my emotional attachment to the previous lens, it's still there, but like it is not going to persuade me to not make that move, right? Like I fully trust the results, right? And the results are these great photos taken by these professionals in that specific environment. So I think, that's exactly how my mind works when it comes to something like that. I do not get locked up in any decision I've made at all, because I'm just willing to say like it was a bad decision, good decision, or not good enough,
No, that's a great perspective to have, and I think this episode has been picture perfect. Oh, sorry, bad joke. But let's wrap up here with final thoughts. So, Shan or Colby, whichever one of you guys want to kick us off here, man.
It's Colby's turn to go first.
Yeah, I was gonna say I made Shan go. So, final thoughts. I don't know. I think one of the things that really caught my attention when we were talking was actually just Shan's point about like having the emotional courage, I guess, to just make a choice and then you can review it after the fact, right? And I think a lot of us get really hung up on doing something because we're worried about what's going to happen. But it's just you never know what's going to happen. You can't plan everything. You can't, especially in social situations. Like man, like good luck trying to map out how the social interaction is going to play out. Like people are so complex that it's just there's infinite possibilities. So yeah, I think just recognize again, like you just gotta you can review how things went afterwards, see what you wish you would have said better, done better, what you wish you would have asked that person and done in that certain situation again, and then take that learning and you can apply it to the next situation that's like that, right? And I'm a big fan of doing stuff like that too, like Jen was saying, where it's like you learn from what happens and you just move on and you take that learning and you're 1% or 0.1% better at this interaction than you were before, right? And if you do that every time, like you will be even thousands of percent better than you were when you started. But if you don't actually take the time to review and think about what's happened, you kind of miss those opportunities to become a better version of yourself or to be better at that thing. And so I just thought it was a really interesting point.
For sure. Shan, what you got? Final thoughts, man.
Yeah, no. So for this topic, I think it's really deep, and unfortunately, I think it's one of those topics to where all of us had strong points, but it's not something you can change in your life just by viewing this episode. So if I were to give advice that no one's asking for, honestly, I would go back to what I said about like whether it be whatever your interest is in, right? Like if you want to post on social media, if you want to start a brand, if you want to create a blog, whatever, I would challenge anyone who's watching this episode and being like, yeah, I really want to get better at like reflecting and trying to like build that emotional confidence and maturity to be able to adjust. I think like the number one advice would be just to start one of those things and promise yourself every time you create a new post or adjust your brand's audience or whatever you're going to do. Like promise yourself you're going to try a little bit harder every time you do it. Because I think inevitably, if you do that, you're going to see progress. And once you see progress, it will change your life forever, 100%. Like I think someone only has to go through it once to really kind of gain that concept that like I should not be closed-minded in any scenario if I can recognize it ever again.
Yeah, and I'll just wrap things up too with some more advice no one's probably asking for. But when we look at this whole conversation was about us looking externally at people and kind of the impression that they make. I would encourage everyone to also think about the way you view yourself, right? From that external perspective, you kind of look at yourself and have a a perspective that you think you're showing to the world. And sometimes that lens even needs a little bit of adjustment or focus. And I think one of the great ways you can do that is by taking time to reflect and figuring out different parts of you. And Shan and Colby know this, but I'm a big advocate of taking some of these assessment tests. Like I've done Gallup Strengths, I've done M Code, People Code, Carl's Jung typology test. A lot of these, probably a good chunk of people have the Enneagram. There's tons of different things out there that really provide insight into who you are. And I'm going to circle back to how I started things off. But if any of our listeners are interested in kind of taking a test that can help with that, the new assessment that I am releasing actually does have an entire section on perspective. And for the time being, until it actually launches, I am giving the opportunity out to folks to take this for free, just for testing purposes and to see how it goes. So if you are interested in getting access to this assessment, please share it down in the comments, right? And I'll make sure you get access into that. And hopefully that would help you be able to kind of see yourself through a different lens and make those adjustments. And you don't want to keep that just for yourself, so make sure you share this podcast with your friends. Again, if you're getting benefit out of this, they could too. And that's what we're here for, is to learn from each other and maximize each other's input and efforts and experience. And that's why we love doing what we do. So thanks for joining us this week, and we will see you next time on Mastermind for the Masses.